Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Nice to meet you finally.
Nice to meet you as well.
How's everything going?
Grand. How about yourselves?
Good. Going pretty well. Margaret, can you hear us?
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
How's everything?
Good.
Great. Thanks for all this, doing this for us tonight. Maplewood people are very vocal, so we like to make sure everyone can participate in these types of things. We're being recorded tonight, by the way, so maybe I should pause it for this section. Pause recording. Might as well. Okay, start over. Okay, welcome everybody. This is the Maplewood Historic Preservation Commission special meeting we're having tonight about the Maplewood Village Historic District nomination. I'm going to open the meeting with our opening statement, take our roll call, and then I'm going to introduce Nancy, our Township Committee liaison, who's going to introduce a little bit about the Township's involvement in this process. And then we're going to have our main presentation by Andrea Tingey from SHPO, the Historic Preservation Office in Trenton, and our consultant who we hired to write the nomination, Margaret Hickey. So let's get started. Pursuant to Section 5, Chapter 231 PL, 1975, this is a state for the record that adequate notice of this meeting has been provided to the public by posting notice with the of the meeting online, actually. Many places we sent special direct mail to township owners and posted, I believe it was posted on the bulletin board, and mailing of the notice to the news record by the township clerk. So roll call: Daniel Wright.
Here.
John Gordon here. Gary Nelson.
Here.
Susan Newberry.
Here.
Eric Hammerberg.
Here.
Ina Onami.
Here.
Julian Helisek.
Here.
Mara Ebert.
Here.
And Lorraine LeBon-Storch. I believe she's here, but
She said here. She typed here.
right here. Okay, great. So everybody's here. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nancy. Nancy Adams, Township Committee and liaison to our commission.
Okay. Do you want to mute everybody, or you want me to mute everybody and then unmute myself?
I can mute everybody. I mean, it looks like everybody's muted already. I'll keep going.
No, not really. So, okay. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Adams, member of the Maplewood Township Committee, which is the governing body, the town council here in Maplewood, and a township liaison to Maplewood HPC. So welcome to this virtual meeting, informational meeting. It's about the proposed Maplewood Village Historic District. The district will be considered for nomination to both the New Jersey and National Registers of Historic Places by the New Jersey State Review Board on October 2nd. So the intention of this meeting is to help clarify the significance and the effects of this nomination, particularly for property owners and merchants within the proposed district, and also for any interested residents in the public. The MPC first pursued the nomination in 2015 at the advice of consultants who, after doing an architectural and historical survey of Maplewood Village, had suggested that it would be likely to be eligible for this honor, and that opinion was confirmed by the state. We on the Maplewood Township Committee then supported the Commission's application for a state grant to hire a preservation consultant to research and write the nomination. That was completed in September of last year, 2019. So that brings us to tonight's informational meeting and to our two expert presenters. Andrea Tingy, I hope I pronounced that right, is the Principal and Historic Preservation Specialist from New Jersey Office of Historic Preservation, affectionately known by all of us as SHPO. She will explain the processes and the benefits of the registers and the rights of the building owners. Also with us is Margaret Hickey of Connolly and Hickory Historical Architects, who wrote the nomination and will give a slide talk on the history and special qualities of Maplewood Village. And then this will be followed by questions and comments moderated by the chair of the HPC, which is John Gordon, who you just heard from. And just a quick comment, while the Township Committee did discuss this, and all of us are in favor in general for this nomination and for the designation. We're as interested, which is why my colleagues are with us, with the exception of Mr. Lembrick, who chairs the Public Safety Committee, so he can't have two heads in two places quite as easily as others. So we're excited to get some clarity on the meaning of the designation as it pertains to public and private properties. And we're pleased that the listing in the registers will not be restrictive to private property owners in the district, but on the other hand, will offer the possibility of tax credits for doing appropriate work on their buildings. It will make municipally owned properties in the districts eligible for grants from the New Jersey Historic Trust. Grants are always good. We need as many as we can get. It'll protect the district from intrusions by the state or federal government, and it will develop community pride and appreciation of Maplewood Village. It also increases the awareness of the village, which all of us near and dear to the hearts of people who live here and people who used to live here, and is often called a small wonder beyond our borders. Give us and the Maplewood Village Alliance the ability to market to a wider consumer base. So this designation, were we to move forward and be approved for it, will enable Maplewood Village to join other central business districts nearby, such as Chatham, Montclair, Madison, Morristown, Summit, Westfield, and the cities of Newark and Paterson. They are all listed on the New Jersey and state registers. So with that, I will turn it over to John to sort of introduce Andrea, or Andrea, you can just take it away if you like, and unmute yourself and begin this presentation, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Nancy.
Nancy.
That was lovely. As Nancy said, I'm Andrea Tingy. I work for the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office, and we're here tonight to talk about the Maplewood Village Historic District and the application for listing in the New Jersey and National Registers of Historic Places. First, I'll give about 10 minutes on the register program and the listing process, which will be followed, as Nancy said, by Margaret Hickey, who has a brief presentation about the district, and then we'll open the floor to your questions and comments. There are 3 levels of historic property registration or designation, and they correspond with different levels of government that bestow them. There's the national level, which is the National Register of Historic Places, the state level, which is the New Jersey Register of Historic Places, and the local level, which in New Jersey is done by municipal government if they have enacted a local historic preservation program. Each designation or registration has a separate and distinct legal process and consequence. For example, private actions on private property are only impacted in New Jersey by local designation. So New Jersey National Register listing does not have any impact on a private property owner's use of their property. However, the purpose of tonight's meeting is to focus on national and state listing. The New Jersey Historic Preservation Office in the Department of Environmental Protection manages New Jersey's efforts to identify, recognize, and protect historic properties. At the heart of our work are the two programs we're here to talk about tonight, the New Jersey Register of Historic Places and the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is the nucleus of what is called the National Historic Preservation Program. New Jersey Register is its state-level counterpart. Both are official lists of historic properties worthy of preservation for the future. The criteria for inclusion in these registers is the yardstick by which we distinguish, for legal purposes, what is historic from what is not. Properties listed in the registers include buildings, structures, sites, objects, and districts that are significant in our history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. In 1966, the United States Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act. This law set up the National Register and made the National Park Service responsible for it. It also caused each state to appoint a State Historic Preservation Officer, or SHPO, and to establish a State Historic Preservation Office, also SHPO. By executive order, the New Jersey State Historic Preservation Officer is the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. The New Jersey Register program was begun in 1970 with the passage of the New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act. This state register was set up to complement the National Register program. What are the consequences of registration? We do not regulate at the state or federal levels what private property owners do to their property. Listing does not restrict or prevent private property owners from altering, tearing down, or otherwise disposing of their property. Nor does the listing dictate what a private property owner must do. Registration does not mean that the government wants to buy private property. It does not mean that you have to open your home or business to visitors, and it does not change local planning or zoning decisions. It does not restrict a private property owner's right to alter or sell their property, and we do not impose any restrictions concerning paint colors. Rather, listing recognizes a property's importance and invites its preservation. Listing imparts an honorific value that can help promote the quality of life in your district. It sets up an expectation that the character of your district will be preserved, and it puts state, county, and municipal planners on notice to that effect. Historic districts listed in the New Jersey Register are given a measure of protection from public undertakings that might otherwise harm the district. While National Register eligibility gives historic properties a measure of protection from projects carried out by federal agencies, New Jersey Register listing offers protection from state, county, and municipal undertakings. More than half of our office staff review public projects for their effects on historic properties. Each year, we examine more than 2,000 public projects for their impact. Federal agencies are required to report to us their projects that might affect properties that are either listed in the National Register or are eligible for listing. And we deal with over 60 federal agencies during the course of a year. We deal with large agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers and the Federal Highway Administration, but also the FDIC and Fish and Wildlife Service. All state, county, and municipal agencies are required to consult regarding projects that they're planning that might encroach upon, damage, or destroy historic properties listed in the New Jersey Register. Listing also gives code officials some increased flexibility in the requirements of building codes through the application of the Rehabilitation Subcode, which was adopted in 1998. Half of the state's 3.1 million homes were built before 1959. Now an owner can elect to improve a building without triggering requirements for substantial additional upgrades. This saves time and expense when rehabilitating existing buildings. Listing also allows buildings owned by county and municipal governments or by nonprofit organizations to take part in the grant and loan programs of the New Jersey Historic Trust. The trust also offers other programs, including grant programs that uses funding from the Discover New Jersey History license plate to help pay for heritage tourism development projects, smaller grants for smaller projects, and historic site management grants. I would urge you to check out the Trust's website at njht.org. Listing also allows, please don't mind my cat, listing also allows owners of commercial or income-producing buildings who rehabilitate their buildings to take an investment tax credit. The Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program offers a 20% federal income tax for substantial rehabilitation projects on National Register listed income-producing properties. The rehabilitation projects must meet the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. My office also assists the National Park Service in administering this program, and there's information available on the National Park Service website, www.nps.gov/tax-incentives.htm. The Historic Preservation Office staff can also help to answer any questions that you might have. So how does a property get listed in the New Jersey National Register of Historic Places? Anyone can prepare an application, and applications are typically prepared by individuals, cultural or historical organizations, government agencies, and professional consultants. Completed applications are submitted to the Historic Preservation Office, where a staff member reviews and evaluates them for eligibility, technical completeness, and substantive sufficiency. Property owners and county and local officials are notified and given an opportunity to comment, and a public meeting like this is held for large historic districts. Once an application is complete, we schedule it for consideration by the New Jersey State Review Board of Historic Sites. This board is an advisory body of architects, historians, architectural historians, archaeologists, and landscape architects who meet about 3 times a year to judge applications for listing to ensure that properties meet the eligibility criteria and that they're adequately and accurately documented. This board will meet virtually on October 2nd, at which time it will officially consider the Maplewood Village Historic District. The board will review the nomination to judge whether or not the district meets the National Register criteria for eligibility and whether the paperwork adequately documents its significance and integrity. At that time, the board may also approve the nomination as written. It may approve it with conditions. The board might also table the nomination or reject it. We don't try to forecast the outcome for any particular nomination, but our experience has been that because the application process is rigorous, usually only properties and districts with a strong claim for eligibility get to this point. The process then proceeds as follows. After the approval of the State Review Board becomes a recommendation to the State Historic Preservation Officer that the property be listed in the registers. An approval signature by the SHPO or her deputy is the action that lists the district in the New Jersey Register of Historic Places, and it's also the official signature that's needed to nominate the property for listing in the National Register. After the signing, my office sends the nomination to the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. If the National Register staff agrees with New Jersey's recommendation, then the keeper of the National Register also signs the nomination. Their signature lists the district in the National Register of Historic Places. How long does this process take? We send nominations to Washington within 90 days after approval by the State Review Board. The National Register has an additional 45 days to act, and that's about 135 days from the date of the Review Board meeting, or 165-ish from tonight. Then it usually takes my office a week or two longer to find out whether or not the National Park Service what the National Park Service action has been, and somewhat longer to get notification letters out to property owners, to the municipal and county governments. If a nomination sails through the rest of the process, the Maplewood Village Historic District could be listed in both registers in approximately 6 months. The New Jersey Historic Preservation Office actively seeks public involvement in the registration process. We welcome letters commenting on the nomination, and you can also send us letters of support or opposition. If you are an owner within the district and you object to listing the district in the registers, you may make your objection felt by writing a notarized letter to our office explaining that you are an owner within the district and that you object to its listing. If a majority of the private properties in a district object in this way, the district will not be listed in the National Register. Remember that the letter must be notarized in order to be counted towards a majority. With the New Jersey Register, the State Historic Preservation Officer has discretion to accept or not to accept the recommendation of the State Review Board, even in the face of owner objection. However, in very few recent cases in which a majority of the private property owners in a district objected, those districts were not listed in the New Jersey Register either. A PDF copy of the draft nomination to be considered by the State Review Board can be found online on our website at www.nj.gov/DEP/1identify/nrsr.htm #process. Thank you. And now you can stop looking at me and start looking at the beautiful images that Margaret's put together of the historic district. So turning it over to you, Margaret Hickey.
Good evening. Do everyone hear me? You can see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. I am Margaret Hickey. I'm Historic Preservation Specialist with Connolly and Hickey Historical Architects. We are located in Cranford, so a short hop, skip, and jump away from Maplewood. Our office did prepare the actually the original initial intensive level survey, which made the recommendation that the Maplewood Village Historic District has the potential to be listed on the New Jersey and National Registers of Historic Places. I'm going to go over sort of a summary of what the nomination says. It is a multi-page document with a lot of detail into it. My summary will be broad. Okay, I don't want you here all night. I don't think any of us all want to be here all night. But it does outline sort of the general scope and why the village should be has the potential to be listed on the New Jersey and National Registers. So the Maplewood Village Historic District incorporates parts of Maplewood Avenue, Durand Road, Highland and Inwood Places, Lenox and Baker Streets, and encompasses portions of the railroad right-of-way. The boundary of the proposed district was first reviewed, as previously noted, as part of the intensive level survey conducted in 2012, and focused on the development along Maplewood Avenue and its adjacent streets, tying the development of railroad service to the commercial development that grew to support the ever-increasing residential population in Maplewood in the early 20th century. The commercial center grew from the influence of passenger rail service and residential population growth, and the framework for this growth was also bounded by physical manifestations of the elevated tracks on the potential district's east and south sides and the residential development on its north and west sides. Let me just, hold on one second. Make this a slideshow. Okay, there we go. Based on the history and development, a period of significance for the Maplewood Historic Village Historic District begins in 1902, when the railroad tracks were elevated and the current station built, to 1961, when the last few remaining empty lots were developed in the last years of the 1950s. Just for an explanation, the period of significance is defined as the span of time in which a property or district attained the significance for which it meets National Register criteria. The proposed district consists of 47 properties or structures, 40 of which are contributing resources and 7 of which are non-contributing resources. The map shown on the screen, the areas hatched in the dark are the non-contributing resources. A contributing resource is a building, site, structure, or object that adds to the historic significance of a property or district. These are typically properties that were present or constructed during the period of significance and retain a high degree of architectural integrity to be able to convey the historical significance of the district. Non-contributing resources, which there are only a few in the proposed district, were either constructed outside the period of significance or have been so altered they no longer reflect the history and development of the district as established by the district's architectural character. An example of a contributing resource is the Maplewood Theater, where an example of a non-contributing resource is 158 Maplewood Avenue, which was constructed in 2016, 2017. So I am going to quickly go over the history and development of Maplewood. It is very brief. I apologize if I smush over a few things. And I also apologize if you've heard this multiple times before. So Maplewood Township today reflects its early 20th century suburban history, yet it has roots in the 17th century when settlers from Connecticut purchased property in the area in what became Newark, one of the 3 original townships that made up Essex County when it was established in 1683. The area centering around what would become Maplewood Village was primarily rural, with some small-scale manufacturing catering to the local communities. This landscape shifted from agricultural roots to suburban development that is evident today in the 19th century with the introduction of the railroad. In 1836, the Morrison Essex Railroad began construction west from Newark, reaching Morristown by 1838, and passed through what would become the center of present-day Maplewood with only a flag stop. The first station did not arrive until circa 1863 at the intersection of Baker and Maplewood Avenue. With the addition of a passenger station, Maplewood began to attract wealthy people from Newark, New York City, and other nearby cities who built country houses, a phenomenon witnessed in many small suburbs along the railroad lines that stretched across northern New Jersey. As residential growth continued, the number of commuter trains to New York increased to meet the growing demand, creating a symbiotic relationship that led to upgraded rail lines, elevated tracks, and the construction of a new railroad station in Maplewood on the east side of the railroad, and a train trestle at Baker Street by 1903. The station was designed in the popular style of the period, Tudor Revival, and incorporates the architectural details that are most prominent in railroad structures, such as broad, sweeping roofs to create cover along the railroad, a tower feature to provide a tall visual marker in the landscape, and facade articulation that is both street-facing and railroad-facing, creating a dual importance on both sides of the track, both sides of the station. Maplewood experienced the dramatic community-wide growth as open space, farmland, and large estates were sold to developers and platted out for residential development, leading to the high-quality buildings that make up the distinctive residential neighborhoods with architectural variety that remain in the township today. Maplewood experienced a significant population increase from the time of the railroad improvement in 1902 to circa 1930. To support this rapidly growing population, schools were constructed, parks were laid out, and the commercial center developed. In 1890, there was only one store at Maplewood Center, Harry Baker's Grocery on Baker Street. By 1920, several more stores had opened on Baker Street, Maplewood Avenue, and the surrounding streets. Civic improvements such as railroad realignments and station improvements all directly precipitated new commercial buildings along Maplewood Avenue and adjacent streets that make up the core of the Maplewood Village Historic District. The nomination itself goes into the minutia of the district's development in terms of road and drainage improvements, road realignments, when buildings were constructed and modified, and other activities that reflect the district's history and development. It speaks to the melding of commercial enterprise as seen in the Maplewood Theater, the bank, the Belmont, with such civic institutions as the Women's Club and the First Church of Christian Science, which are both part of the core of the commercial center, but also serve as buffers between the commercial center and adjacent residential neighborhoods. The nomination also discusses not only the construction at the time, but the reworking of commercial storefronts in the mid-20th century to respond to the changing needs of the consumer and the increased influence of the automobile. So based on the history and development of the Maplewood Village Historic District, the nomination lays out what its significance is under criteria A and C. Criterion A means the district is worthy of inclusion on the National Register for its association with events, activities, or developments that were important in the past. And criterion C means a district is worthy of inclusion on the National Register for its architectural history and the buildings and structures that embody this history. Under criterion A, the historic district is a representation of the historic commercial growth associated with advances in passenger rail transportation and corresponding residential development in Maplewood, where passenger service began in 1860s and spurred moderate residential growth. It wasn't until after the existing lines were elevated and a more substantial station was constructed in 1902 that the township transitioned from a rural enclave to a densely populated railroad suburb, retaining a pastoral quality by the 1930s. The establishment of the commercial downtown adjacent to the railroad is directly correlated to this increase in suburban development. And today this district reflects its endurance to remain a cohesive collection of commercial and mixed-use buildings, despite the pressure from the automobile culture of the mid-20th century. A rejection of these pressures solidified the continued importance of passenger service to Maplewood and the viabilities of businesses, so that today the proposed district continues to reflect the architectural character of the commercial district as established by the 1930s. Under criterion C, the historic district is significant for its civic and commercial buildings, with numerous examples constructed using the popular architectural vocabulary of the early 20th century, articulated in a built form reflective of use. While limited commercial development began along Maplewood Avenue after 1863, such development was often in the form of shop house commercial buildings. Once the railroad expanded in 1902, these smaller shop houses made way for more larger and two-part block commercial buildings. These buildings were set close to the property line, occupied most of the property, and were designed specifically to invite people into the public ground floor spaces through the use of large expanses of windows and a clear articulation in the ground floor facades through use of cornices and band courses above the shop windows, distinguishing the mercantile spaces at street level from the upper floors of either professional offices or residential units. This two-block form was not only popular for the shops, but it was also often adopted for theaters and banks, as seen in the Maplewood Theater constructed in 1926-27 and the Maplewood Bank and Trust Company building constructed in 1927. Although the two-part commercial block dominates, the one-part commercial block has almost equal standing in the district. These buildings, often of one story with space solely dedicated to commercial or retail functions at the ground floor, took on similar architectural traits of the two-part commercial block in both the articulation of the facades and maximizing the property, but were often of a lower comparative cost than their larger counterparts, allowing for that rapid growth seen especially in this district in the early 20th century. The larger buildings of this type contain several storefronts that could be combined or stand alone depending on the tenant, and occupied dominant corners. Such examples include the one on the screen, which is the Belmont, and one up the street is the Sirlin Shops. By and large, the commercial buildings in the district, constructed primarily in the early 20th century, show a strong influence of classical architecture, with facades simply articulated in brick, stucco, limestone panels, and terracotta with little or subdued ornament. The craftsman influences can also be seen in a number of Tudor Revival and Spanish Revival styles, which shows the influence of European architecture adapted to the commercial block form. Art Deco design was adopted on a number of buildings constructed in the district in the 1920s and 1930s. The appeal of the Art Deco in commercial buildings was the use of geometric forms expressed in a simple structural framework, and was often used to emphasize verticality in what were often only 1- and 2-story buildings. Such examples, as previously seen, were the Belmont and the Maplewood Theater. Another feature of the architecture of the Maplewood Historic District is the many works produced by licensed architects found in both commercial and institutional buildings. Of particular note for institutional buildings are the Sunday School and Reading Room, designed by Bernard Mueller for the First Church of Christ Scientist, Maplewood, and the Women's Club building designed by Clifford Wendehack. So this is the Women's Club, and this is the First Church of Christ Scientist before a later addition. These architects utilize the popular revival styles for site and use-specific building forms and for building complexes that helped, as noted previously, to serve as buffers between the commercial downtown and the neighboring residential areas. In conclusion, the Maplewood Village Historic District embodies the development of commercial districts within fast-growing suburban towns in Northeast New Jersey, and the pace of its development in the first approximately 30 years of the 20th century is reflected in the architecture. Despite the increased reliance on the automobile and the pressure for parking in the mid-20th century, the commercial buildings within the core of the district are intact along both sides of Maplewood Avenue. The defining edges, namely the railroad and the residential neighborhoods, clearly demark the boundaries of the core commercial district and influence the scale of the architecture and the tight density established in the early 20th century from block to block along Maplewood Avenue. The district remains decidedly a local destination, providing goods and services to residents. Furthermore, it remains a walkable destination and convenient to the nearby neighborhoods and civic core located east of the railroad. The significance of the district is in its ability to convey, through its architecture and the composition of the streetscape, the role of advances in transportation to transform a rural enclave into a vibrant suburb, as seen in one snippet of the community, while also bracing popular styles in the commercial and mixed-use built forms to create a cohesive architectural ensemble from one end of the district to the other. I actually put up on the screen where you can find the nomination, and if anybody has any questions, you can also reach out to me in my office. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
All right, so the last sort of half of the presentation will be open to the public for questions and answers. I am going to ask everyone to post their questions in the chat. I've already got several, so I'm going to start with the ones I already got. So I'll read the questions, and we're going to let Andrea and Margaret and our other experts and Township committee members respond to the questions, and then we'll go from there. So let me get to the first question. So First question, Michael Shapanko asked several questions actually, so we'll start with his. He was first. I will read off your questions, Michael, and then we'll let the experts answer. The first question is, exactly what must owners of properties in the proposed Maplewood Historic District do to put an objection on the record to the State Historic Preservation Office? So,
Property owners must write a letter to the State Historic Preservation Office, and they must give their name, address, and block and lot, identifying themselves as owners of a property in the proposed district. And then they may state their objection to registration. If they choose to explain the objections, they may, but they don't need to. And then that they should sign the letter, and they should get that letter notarized and get it to the State Historic Preservation Office.
okay, Michael's second question was, are there any municipally designated sites or districts in Maplewood, and what are they? So let me unmute a few of our commissioners so we can have everyone chime in. Yes, Daniel, but we have, what is it, 11 properties that are historic sites. We don't have any districts at this time. And let's see if I can rattle them off to you.
I can rattle them, John.
Okay,
The
go for
list
it.
open. They're all listed on our website, historicmaplewood.com, but they are Duran Hedden House, Aaron Brown House, Ezekiel Ball House, Gildersleeve House, Headley Zeller's House, Jonas Ball House, the Municipal Building, the Old Stone House, Timothy Ball House, Vauxhall, the Women's Club, and Memorial Park. Those are all the locally designated sites. There's a smaller list that are on the National Register. I believe the Municipal Building and Memorial Park are designated by the state and the federal government. Susan, are there any others that are on the state and national? I think those might be the only two that are state and national designations.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So next question from Michael. Again, let's see, hold on. Just gotta get it right here. To the extent property owners are concerned that their properties will become subject to Historic Preservation Commission jurisdiction under the Maplewood ordinance, what if any protection do they have to prevent state historic designation being used as justification for the commission to recommend municipal designation to the Township Commission? So I could take a stab at answering that if no one else wants to, but basically this is just for the state and national register. As we've said, this is not a local designation. A local designation is something that could come up separately, but is a completely different process. And obviously it would have to go before the TC and have all the public input, and the public would have to weigh in on this. So that would be a different process and would obviously have different regulation to it. So this, you know, having this historic district set up helps that process in a sense, but it's not destined to happen, so to speak. It's not a guarantee.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that most of the buildings that are locally designated, they're not designated by the state and federal registers. So it's not like this is a necessary step to locally designate a building.
Okay, so I mean, if people have further questions on these responses, you can add them in the chat and I'll get get to all of them. I'm just going through the first batch I have lined up here. The next question from Michael was, does the Historic Commission have any pending recommendations to the Township Committee for designation of any sites or districts for a municipal designation? I'd say no. I mean, we're researching a couple houses, but they're not in the village. But we're not, we don't have any pending recommendations. We're not at that point on anything. Next from Michael was, is the proposed Maplewood Village Historic District discussed in the historic preservation element in the Township Master Plan? I believe it is not, because this is a newer development from when the Master Plan was created. But other commissioners chime in if I am misspeaking on that. All right, let me load up some more questions. Hold on a second. Gotta go back a ways here. Oop. Bear with me one sec. All right. So Michael made a statement, I guess I could just read this. This is to bring, Michael says, this is to bring attention to the property owners that if they want to object to the designation, they must send historic, well, we just said that, State Historic Preservation Office a notarized letter objecting to the designation. The key points sheet transmitted under the August 31st, 2020 letter from the township clerk stated the objection needs to be in by September 28th, 2020. Ms. Tingey advised this evening that that if a majority of the owners object, the federal designation would not be approved. As to the state designation, she advised the State Historic Preservation has discretion, but past practice has been that when a majority of the property owners objected, the designation was not granted on the state level. That's what we're referring to there. To the extent that the designation concerns property owners, written, timely, notarized objection is the way in which they can make their objections counted. I believe that's a fair statement. Andrea, you want to confirm that?
I agree that it's different words, but it's the same meaning as my comments. I guess the only thing that I would add is that the property owner votes are counted as individual property owners. So in a case where you have a husband and wife co-owning a property, that's two property owners. And in a case where you have one person who owns multiple buildings in a historic district, that is still one owner, one vote, regardless of whether they own two properties or six properties.
Okay.
And so that's a little bit more refinement on how owner objection votes are counted.
Thank you for clarifying. That sounds important. So next question from Reed Keene. There's just, he's saying thank you to Margaret, community copy of the presentation. I think she had posted the link, and it's on the SHPO website too. Or no, I'm sorry, her presentation. Would you be able to offer the presentation you made tonight, I guess is what Reed is referring to.
Yes, I can send it to you and you can post it. That's fine. Yep.
Okay. So
Maybe you could put that link in the chat.
if it's on.
Well,
Is it-
yeah, I'll put that link for the presentation for the nomination. Sure, absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, Reed's second question, do multiple property owners have to submit individual letters per property owned? I guess that's similar to
No,
what you.
because they only get one vote, regardless of how many properties they own. They could list all the properties that they own in the one letter, but again, they would only count as one vote.
So, okay, moving to the next question, thank you, is from Ben Profaci. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing. What would be reasons that property owners would object? Maybe some examples of what they objected to can tell us in the past. I don't know. I don't see why anyone
Say
would
that
object.
from my pure
Property
past
owner.
experience is that they usually don't articulate a reason.
Okay,
So
Well,
I would defer.
John, we have several property owners here. It might, you can unmute yourselves. I'm curious as to that too. So I would love to hear some of the reasons the property owner's objection.
Should we get through the questions, which is only maybe one or two more, and then we can just sort of open it up a little bit more?
Okay.
I don't know. I just want to cover the questions that were already submitted because maybe it'll answer other people's questions. Okay, next question is from Jim Wilson. Says, hello, thank you for the good presentation. My family goes back a ways in Maplewood. We always loved the field and the school. Are these to be considered as part of the district? And then, should I open it up?
So to clarify, the question is whether or not the school is in the district.
I was trying to unmute him so he could ask directly, but
It's just, I mean, I'm James Rickleton's great grandson. My grandmother loved playing the field, and James taught at the school, of course. And so those are very historic and interesting places to us. And they're not in the district. I just wonder, was that a deliberate decision, or is that per standard or something like that?
So are you referring to the high school, or are you referring to, which is, I guess, Columbia, if I'm correct?
Yeah.
And
I
then
apologize.
there's also a
No.
middle school that's very proximate to the district.
No,
Excuse me.
it's the middle school she's talking about, which is the core of it was called the Rickleton School at one point.
So that's across from the library.
yeah.
Yes. It's close to the village.
Rickleton was a great photographer, and I'm very glad that his name, it was from Maplewood, and I'm very glad that his name is not forgotten.
Hear, hear.
All right, so I'll go to the next question.
Actually, one of the issues with designating any of the schools, whether it be on any level, is control of the school district, because we have a combined school district of Maplewood and South Orange. But the middle school is not intended to be part of the this district.
No.
Okay, so next question from Larry Fisher. He said, if you own multiple properties, does the property owner have multiple votes? I think we answered that question. That right? The answer is no.
Correct.
Okay, next is from Kathy. How will this designation be handled compared to the designation of the private homes you listed in terms of oversight, restrictions, property owner rights? And then there's a second question. So let's start with that.
So the municipally designated private homes, the 11 private homes, are subject to review by the Historic Preservation Commission per municipal ordinance. And the standards of review and the purview of the Historic Preservation Commission are set up in the municipal ordinance. And that's a completely separate legal process and a separate set of restrictions. But generally speaking, in New Jersey, local historic preservation commissions are trying to preserve the historic character of buildings and are concerned to ensure that changes that are made to them don't adversely impact the character of the building and the character of the community that they're within. Although different municipalities cast that net wider or narrower. So I would let a Maplewood commissioner perhaps speak to that in a little bit. In terms of this designation for New Jersey and National Register listing, there would be absolutely no state regulatory oversight of any private action taken on private property. So if you own your home and you want to replace the roof or all the windows, as long as it's in conformance with all municipal laws and regulations and permit requirements, you can do that. There's no regulatory oversight by us. However, if you were going to apply to the federal government for a HUD loan, there would be oversight of that project because that's federal involvement, and that would be reviewable under Section 106. Similarly, if you were a nonprofit agency and you got one of the New Jersey Historic Trust grants, that would be a state undertaking and would be reviewable pursuant to the New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act. So again, if you're a nonprofit, you're a for-profit, you're a private homeowner, and you're doing something to your property with private funding, whether it's your own money or whether it's a loan from the bank, if it's listed on the New Jersey National Register, you can do whatever you want to do as long as you're in conformance with all municipal permit requirements.
Okay, so the second half of her question was, how is this able to obtain grants and tax treatment when private homes are not?
That's a very good question. The federal tax incentive program for for-profits came about in the 1980s, and I can't speak specifically to what the legislative intent was. I can only say that that's the way the program is set up. In terms of state grant funding and some of the county grant programs that exist, there is a constrained funding pool available, and the choice was that because it is coming from tax dollars, that it should be spent on properties that were perceived to have the most public benefit, and those that were owned by government and nonprofit agencies. And they have to be listed in the New Jersey National Register as sort of their bona fide that they really are a historic property and are worthy of our tax dollars being spent on them for historic preservation purposes.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to move to the next question from James Nathanson. The building at 160 Maplewood Avenue was approved by the Planning Board and the Maplewood Village Alliance in 2016. That property was previously owned by the Township of Maplewood. If historical designation had been in effect at that time, would the approval process been impacted in any way?
Can we be specific about what that building, which building that is?
It was the post office, right?
It's the post office.
The post
Jim,
office.
why don't you unmute yourself and clarify your question?
The old, is this the old post office?
Yeah,
Yes.
the post office building. And the
Okay.
Claris is the new building that was put up in its place.
Well, I'm not being very familiar with the 100% of the specifics of the wheres and the whens. If I could extrapolate from your question and abstract it out a little bit, I would say that in a New Jersey and National Register listed district, specifically in a New Jersey Register listed district, if a municipality plans new construction on either land that once had development on it and is now vacant or has always been vacant, they would have to apply to the State Historic Preservation Office and through the DEP for prior approval pursuant to the New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act. So there's an actual application form that gets filled out, and the project is described, plans and specifications are given. That comes into our office for review. Our staff looks at it to see whether or not the application is complete. If it is complete, then we look at it a little bit harder to see whether or not it meets the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. If the project meets those guidelines, then we are able to administratively approve the project. If the project does not meet those guidelines, it is referred to the New Jersey Historic Sites Council for their review in an open public format. The applicant is able to talk about what the nature of the public good is. And so you might have a need for low-income housing, you might have a need for additional school space, you might have the need for a hospital, and you would talk about why this new construction is needed to benefit the community and how that balances with historic preservation. The board would look at perhaps the design of the new construction and the site plan, and then they would make a recommendation to the Assistant Commissioner for Natural and Historic Resources about whether or not the project should be approved as submitted, approved with conditions, temporarily denied, or denied. And then the Assistant Commissioner has the ability to make the final legally binding decision on the application and impose conditions. If conditions are imposed as part of the authorization, the applicant has, I believe, 60 days to accept the conditions in writing, or the project is automatically denied.
So, just to clarify, what happened is that property was owned by the Township of Maplewood. It was a post office, and the township owned the land, and at the end of there was a long-term lease, and at the end of that lease, the building was conveyed, became owned by the township. The township sold that property to a private owner who then developed the property. And it was subject to all, the planning board and Maplewood Village Alliance approval. So in that case,
the sale of property out of municipal ownership would be a reviewable undertaking.
okay.
And it would be found to be in conformance with the standards if an easement was attached to the sale that basically puts the same regulatory burden on the new owner that the municipality already enjoyed.
So it would have added a layer of complication perhaps, but that wouldn't necessarily have in any way forestalled the ultimate approval is what
it would have added another layer of review and another opportunity for public comment. But I would say, and I did bridge projects in the state for over 10 years. And for all the bridge replacements in historic districts all over the state, many were approvable as meeting the standards. And I am struggling off the top of my head to think of any that were outright denied. So it was always a question of sort of tweaking the design in order to maximize that balance between historic preservation and other competing areas of the public good, like public safety.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'm loading up a little bit more and have more questions coming. Just give me 1 second. Hold on. So next was from Township Committee Member Vic DeLuca. Question is, are properties owned by New Jersey Transit considered public or private properties? I don't know if Vic is still here, but yes, he is. He's welcome to unmute.
Andrea was going to answer.
I would say that New Jersey Transit regularly submits their projects on listed property for review under the New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act, whether it's usually station improvements.
In this case, it's a surface parking lot that he's referring to.
Again, I think that falls in the area of things that regularly are reviewed by the office under the act.
So that would make it public, basically, sounds like. So,
Patty Chrisman is in our audience tonight. Hello, Patty. Do you want to add anything to what Andrea's just said?
Yes, the New Jersey Transit, any type of projects they did, they always send them in to the State Historic Preservation Office.
I mean, isn't our train line part of an historic corridor anyway?
It is, but that's under section 106.
Right, so it would fall into that review process
For
regardless.
federal projects.
Yeah.
But even though the station is not listed in the National Register currently, New Jersey Transit, just by matter of course, does submit all their projects and historic stations to the SHPO for regulation, for regulatory review.
okay, thank you. Next one is just a comment from Enda. Thank you for this terrific presentation. I hope the historic district does get created. Thank you for that, Enda. And then Margaret, if you look in the chats, Margaret posted the National Register nomination link, and then her email address if you want to ask her questions directly. All right, next one. Make sure I have this figured out. Okay, Christopher Rowe, question. I am an historical property owner. I objected to my designation by the municipality and was designated over my objection. A property owner might object if the municipality with take the additional step of designated the property under municipal law. It will then restrict your rights to make changes to your own home. We tried to change the windows on our home and it was extremely difficult. In some ways, your home becomes an extension of public property. It's kind of a separate topic than what we're talking about tonight, but.
Yeah, I think Andrea or Margaret, if you could just make it clear again that this is different from a local designation or a local ordinance, because that seems to be what has people kind of tied up.
Sure. I mean, in New Jersey, municipalities are given an option about whether or not they wish to extend their zoning ordinances to encompass historic preservation and the protection of historic resources within their boundaries. And it makes the statewide enabling legislation makes requirements about the qualifications of a historic preservation commission, the membership, the numbers. There are some issues about some guidance about what kinds of properties can be designated in terms of landmarks and districts. And it talks about how the local designation criteria have to be specified, and that there also has to be a specified criteria for how projects are judged and a process by which projects are reviewed. And that's all established by municipal ordinance. So the New Jersey and National Register listing is a completely separate process. The National Register designation in terms of regulatory process, properties are subject to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, but that act looks at all properties that are listed in the National Register and all properties that meet the eligibility criteria for listing. So whether or not you're actually listed doesn't matter in terms of receiving those protections or the benefits of that regulatory process. Whereas the New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act looks at all agencies of state, county, and municipal government and their instrumentalities, like the school board or like New Jersey Transit, and says that if they're going to undertake a project that might affect a property listed in the New Jersey Register, they must first seek prior approval from the Commissioner of DEP. So in that case, being listed is one of the triggers for the additional regulatory process and protection. But there are 3 separate regulatory outcomes from 3 separate designation or registration processes.
So John, this is Deputy Mayor Dean Daffis. May I follow up with Andrea on that point, please?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Andrea, you and I have spoken a few times. Thank you again for facilitating this very important information gathering opportunity tonight for the public. I think I just want to go back to Nancy's question about this, which relates back to Mr. Rowe's concern. It may also be, as Nancy said, tying up others who are participating and joining us here tonight. I guess the bottom line is, and not to get twisted in all the words that we're using and all the big words of the regulations, once you have a national and state listing, does that open the door to a local designation? I think that is what people are worried about. And if you could explicitly and directly address that, I think we can answer a lot of these questions. Thank you.
I think there is no explicit or direct link between the preparation of a National Register nomination or New Jersey Register nomination and a recommendation by a local historic preservation commission to initiate the local designation process. And to varying degrees around the state, local historic preservation ordinance, the criteria for local designation mirrors or matches or doesn't match the National Register criteria. So that's an important factor to look at when you're looking at things. But, and different municipalities have different standards in terms of what format a municipal designation would have in terms of what kind of a report it would be, or what kind of research and documentation is needed. But regardless of sort of what that input is, the municipal process has to be followed, and the public meetings and all of that have to happen as part of that municipal designation process. I mean, to be honest, from being the certified local government statewide coordinator for several years, what I saw in terms of local designation reports were often 1 to 5 pages in length versus what we see for a National Register nomination, which in this case has got to be over 75 pages. Margaret could probably speak to that a little bit better, but there's a lot more detail and specificity in a National Register nomination than would be required for a local designation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have another question from Reed Keene, which is, I think, a very important question and sort of is going through my head. It says, so if a property owner, or if a property is owned by multiple people, then they get as many votes as members of an ownership group. Like if it's owned by an LLC and there's 10 members, what does that mean, Andrea?
It's my understanding that there are several different types of LLCs. And so in a situation of a specific LLC objection, that we might have to look into the specific structure of that LLC to see whether or not it is 1 vote or many votes. I know a corporation would be 1 vote. And again, like a husband and wife are 2 votes. You know, the estate of might be 1 vote, but you know, if there are specific heirs, you might get into multiple votes. So the tallying can be quite complex and nuanced.
So if there's 3 friends that own a building, jointly, like a third ownership, do they get 3 votes?
If
Just hypothetically.
yeah, I mean, if a husband and wife and their adult child as 3 individuals all co-owned a building, all 3 of those individuals would get a vote.
Okay.
Even though it's that one building on that one tax parcel, there would be 3 votes. But also, if there is one property owner who owns 6 buildings or 6 parcels, they're only going to get 1 vote.
We had an example a few years back where a property was owned by a condominium association. And the condominium association had many owners, but the part of the property that was impacted by the district was not held by the individual owners of the condominium. It was part of the common undivided condominium association property. So that condominium association got 1 vote in that case. But if the district had been more expansive and included property owned by the individual owners, they would each have also gotten a vote because they have a fee title ownership interest in their portion of that property.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Bob Craig, my colleague from the State Historic Preservation Office.
Thanks, Bob. Another question from Michael Shapanka. So Michael says, Maplewood's ordinances pertinent to the Historic Preservation Commission are at 271-73 to 271-87 of the Land Development Ordinance. 271-79 deals with the procedure for recommendation to the Township Committee for designation. If local designation occurs, then the rest of the ordinance applies, i.e. C, certification of appropriateness requiring a public hearing, 271-82D1. Permit for minor work would require approval by chair of commission or the chair's designee. So I would just comment that this is dealing with local designations and not with the National Register and the State Register. So I don't think this is applicable to what we're talking about tonight. Next, from Maria Marcatos, question: if an area within the district is owned by the town and is now used as a parking lot, would the building of a parking deck or garage have to be approved by the state? That's a good question.
Yes.
It would.
Proposed new construction in the historic district would require an application for project authorization. Even if the property is considered non-contributing, the regulatory process tries to ensure that non-contributing properties don't become even more non-contributing. And so it would be reviewable. You know, a small project like reconfiguring the surface lot would probably be seen in conformance with the standards. New construction would have to be looked at more carefully, and the decision about whether or not it represented an encroachment would be very fact sensitive to the case.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions in the chat.
John, this is Victor Luca. Can I just follow up on that?
Please.
So you said new construction. Is that new public construction or new private construction also?
We only regulate public actions.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is Harold Barber. I have a couple of questions.
Please.
Under state designation, and I'm an owner of a building in the area, will having a state designation increase the cost for any of the owners in any way whatsoever? Because I assume that if you work on a designated building, I assume you have to have certified individuals, or you're saying you don't have to have that? Or do you need other plans, or you don't need other plans?
No, New Jersey National Register listing imposes no additional regulatory burden to private property owners doing privately funded work on their private property. Actually, the benefits of being able to take advantage of the federal income tax credit program for certified rehabilitations on certified properties would be a financial advantage to private property owners, and also being able to take advantage of the New Jersey Rehabilitation Subcode, which allows you to tailor your work to what you want to be doing, what you want to achieve as a project, and doesn't sort of say, oh, you're doing a major improvement to your project, and now you have to fix all these other things about your existing building that don't meet current code. So reconfigure your staircase and do this, that, and the other thing. And all of a sudden, the price of the project goes up. By taking advantage of the New Jersey Rehabilitation Subcode, you can make improvements to a historic building without triggering a lot of those other ancillary project requirements that would be normally required under the Uniform Construction Code.
So you're saying if I did something to the facade, the outside of a building, I would not have to go to the state authority and get an architectural rendering or get approval or anything whatsoever different than I would do at this moment?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, we have a couple more questions in the chat. I'm going to go to that now. John James from Maplewood Village Alliance. First question is, were any of the buildings in the Village Alliance on Dunnell Road considered as a part of this nomination? Let Margaret answer that.
Those are the buildings next to the train station. Yeah, they were looked at. They were determined too far out of the boundary. We have to make a very tight boundary when we have to jump properties, things like that. It makes it difficult to actually list some things, so that the boundaries are actually very tight as proposed. But we did look farther afield. So the boundaries are based on a survey of options that we came to a conclusion as a group, really. So.
And the second half of John's question is the train station in or out of the district? I believe you have it in, correct?
Yeah, the train station is in, yep.
Okay, thank you. So, oh, sorry, I'm getting the next one loaded up here. From Maria Marcatos again, question, could a public property be sold to a person? Would they be able to build on it? It's similar to the question we had earlier from Jim.
Right. The sale out of public ownership is a reviewable undertaking. Sales where easement or some other mechanism is attached to the sale that ensures the same protection is passed on to the new owner are usually found to be not an encroachment and can move forward. But a sale without that protection would found to be an encroachment and would have to go through the full regulatory process. And so what the private person could do after the sale would depend on the outcome of the regulatory action on the proposed sale.
Okay. Thank you. So one thing we would like to just hear from the property owners, it was sort of brought up before, is what would their objections be after hearing the presentation tonight and it's been spelled out pretty clearly. We'd like to hear from their representatives and the owners you know, what objections they would have at this time. And if there's anything that's not clear, please ask and let us know. And if I have to unmute anyone, let me know.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Larry Fisher.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good. I guess the real question that I have, because I feel like way back in the beginning of the presentation, I heard two answers to, I think, probably the biggest concern of most property owners. And it sounds that being part of this historic preservation designation is fairly benign, unless it really triggers something with the municipality. And I believe Andrea said it was not necessarily a step to that, but unfortunately with the Zoom screen, I couldn't see who said something to the contrary, that yes, this would be potentially a step to those codes that I believe somebody else brought up in a question, that in the future could give us a big problem between going to the town, then to the Maplewood Village Alliance, and then to a historic preservation society in the town, really hindering us from developing our properties, even just repairing them, or adding, I don't know, certain, just better things to the buildings that might have some, visual effect that might not be allowed in the future. So thus forcing us to keep our buildings sort of in the, old world and not actually being able to improve them. So I think that's clear. But so again, I'm not sure who said that, but that's that I think would be the biggest concern, is this being a step towards more oversight on what we can do and can't do.
So does the state historic preservation people on the call have any experience in other places around the state where this has actually been something that happened, that a commercial district or even a neighborhood district became a historic registry, on their historic registry, and then the municipality is like, oh, we should make all these buildings, protect all these buildings if that's the case? I mean, that's what I'm hearing that Larry's worried about.
I think that you can probably pretty easily understand that when you look across the state of New Jersey and you look at how municipalities approach things, it's a very, very colorful tapestry. And so, there are probably every different scenario you could find an instance. So you could find an instance where a municipality listed a district on the New Jersey National Registers and then decided to enact a local historic preservation ordinance and to establish a locally designated district that was going to reflect the New Jersey National Register listed district. I'm sure you could come up with case studies where that's happened. But you can also come up with case studies where there was a locally designated district and then they decided to pursue New Jersey National Register designation as a second step. We have instances all over the state where New Jersey National Register districts are larger than a sort of corresponding local designated district. And we also have the converse where the local district is larger and the New Jersey Register listed district is smaller. We have cases where there are New Jersey Register listed districts in towns that have local historic preservation ordinances and they have not created a local district. And you have towns that have locally designated districts that they've never pursued for New Jersey National Register designation. Again, usually the threshold of documentation for local designation is more streamlined than is required for National Register and New Jersey Register designation. And in many places, the survey data that has already been compiled in Maplewood would be sufficient to support municipal pursuit of designation if it was decided to be pursued and to go through the process, which is normally to be proposed by the Historic Preservation Commission, commented on by the planning board in an open public meeting, because it would be a change to zoning, and then it would be a proposed ordinance in front of the governing body that would have to go through first and second readings also in a public format. So all of those steps have to take place for municipal designation, regardless of whether or not there is New Jersey or National Register listed property that may or may be coincident with the area that is being considered for municipal designation.
I think, thank you, Andrea. I'm sorry for jumping in here. Larry, I'm not sure if you're satisfied that your question was answered. I mean, yes, we live in New Jersey and home turf, and everyone does things a little bit differently. And I like the way you put it, Andrea, colorful tapestry. I think I'll use that, if I may, going forward myself. But I think essentially what Larry was asking, and the fear here by the private property owners who are already under a lot of regulatory oversight, in Maplewood Village, in a special improvement district, right? We got to keep that in mind too. This is not just any commercial center. This is a special improvement district. And so state regs kick in and regulatory oversight exists. Larry's question essentially, and Larry, correct me if I'm wrong, is does something like this freeze us in time? Does it freeze us in time? And so, Andrea, can you comment on that? And can you, when you're commenting, maybe provide examples? I mean, there are examples of other special improvement districts right next door to us who have gone through this process, who are listed. Has it frozen them in time? What is your experience?
I mean, historic preservation is not about freezing anything in time. It is not about stopping change. It's about managing change and ensuring that we're making thoughtful changes so that we don't adversely impact the cultural heritage that we're passing on to future generations. We review, again, thousands of projects on listed property, and there are very often very elegant solutions on how to accommodate the sponsor's goals for the project and still preserve the character defining features of the historic building and its historic character. We have huge tax act projects. The one that comes to mind is the Jersey City Medical Center, which is an enormous building that has been successfully rehabilitated into housing using the federal tax incentive and done to meet all federal historic preservation standards. I know that in Collingswood, they had, I believe it was Collingswood, they had a historic movie theater that they found a way to keep most of its character defining features and transform it into a Planet Fitness gym, obviously before COVID, but still a radical change in use for the historic property, but maintaining the historic character of the building so that it still conveyed on the streetscape what that vibrant downtown had been like. Is that sort of addressing what you were looking for, Dean?
I think it's really Larry's question. I'm just a spokesperson here. Larry, does that help you more?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, yes, it does. You know, I own properties in Montclair, and I haven't seen anything necessarily happen there again, but I'm not sure what area of Montclair is part of the historic district. I don't know. Do you know? Is it just?
Montclair has several historic districts. Some are more in residential character. I know that they do have at least one commercial district, but in terms of precisely where the boundaries are, I would have to do some digging around to look at their municipal website to figure that out.
Okay. I mean, not really.
They have a really good website. If you go to their planning they actually have an interactive map on what are listed districts. I think there's actually 3 commercial, they're all commercial districts. There are no residential districts in Montclair. And then there are potential districts in Montclair that are somewhat regulated by the HBC, but the actual districts are regulated by the commercial ones are regulated by the HBC. And their website is really quite good with their interaction and tells you what the boundaries are and what their rules are and everything like that.
Andrea, these the changes you were talking about and where you can maintain character defining features, they're all voluntarily done by the private owners, right? They're not told that they have to.
If it's locally designated.
No, I'm talking about National Register. Yeah.
Some of the projects that I was talking about, like the Jersey City Medical Center, because they were going for the federal tax incentive program, that's a federal action. And so the 106 review applies to those applications.
So if you're getting
in order to get that tax benefit, they had to go through a regulatory process.
So that actually brings up another question, because if you're trying to, as a property owner, the only maybe benefit that I heard were possibly these tax incentives. But now you're kind of what I'm hearing you say is any tax incentive would trigger oversight as to what we did to a building. Thus, if I don't want oversight, I'm not hearing any benefit as a property owner to being on the historic designation.
But if I could chime in on this, the thing is, Larry, the National Register designation opens up a shall we say, a funding source for selective repairs or improvements.
Mm-hmm.
And you're really only restricted in the work that you do relative to the funding that you're applying for. For instance, I've worked in historic preservation for 33 years. Mostly New York City, but also Boston, Washington, D.C., and also on the Preservation Commission here for a decade and a half. Specifically, I did a project in Boston where it was a National Register designated property, and they wanted to replace their HVAC system. And they were able to apply for historic designation credits for that. And they got a boatload of money for doing that. And their only restrictions were that the work relative to that work was reviewed. So they couldn't put big old chillers on the top of the roof that stuck out and looked like a carbuncle growing out of the roof of a building. But other work that they did in the lobby was not impacted. So from the standpoint, from my perspective, my professional perspective, this is a positive attribute for the township with very little negatives, because it opens a funding source that we don't have available to us right now. You as commercial owners don't have historic tax credit availability to you because you're not designated. But if we're on the National Register, all of a sudden historic tax credits become available to you.
And I guess just to sort of refine that, you could still apply, even if your building individually met the criteria. You could either go through the process yourself or pay someone like Margaret to list your individual building. But by being part of the district already, you can take advantage of it without having that expense, and you can take advantage of it as a contributing building. Whereas if you weren't in a district and you don't meet the criteria individually, you wouldn't be eligible for the credit. So it opens it up to more property owners than if individual property owners were taking on the burden of financing registration individually.
Plus not having to pay the fees for doing the background work and the designation submissions.
It's also worth adding on to Andrea's comment that there are vastly more buildings that are contributing to historic districts than there are buildings that individually meet the criteria. The criteria are pretty stiff. And if you have an opportunity to piggyback onto an eligible district and your building is contributing, it's a good idea to think very seriously about that. Chances are, if you looked, I don't know what Margaret's view of this is, and we haven't officially evaluated Maplewood for how many individually eligible buildings there are, but if out of the 40 some, if there were half a dozen that were individually eligible, that would be a lot.
Well, we do have a instance recently where in the Military Park Historic District in Newark, there was a building that had been found to be non-contributing in the initial New Jersey National Register listing. They wanted to do a tax act and they had to fund additional documentation for the entire district to expand the period of significance and the area of significance so that they could be considered for a tax act. We haven't really talked about it, and it's getting on the edges of my area of expertise, but there's been a lot of research about heritage tourism and people who go to places to enjoy them for their historic value. And I know that national studies have found that people who travel to areas for their historic value tend to stay longer and spend more. And so there's the Main Street program that encourages business districts to embrace their historic character as a way of increasing business and the local economy of the area. The New Jersey Historic Trust website has an awful lot more information about the economics of historic preservation and heritage tourism.
So let me just ask just a follow-on question. Non-contributing properties within a district are not eligible for the tax credits?
That is correct.
They are not eligible.
That is correct. Non-contributing properties would not be a certified eligible property getting a certified rehab. So you have to both be a historic property, so you'd have to be contributing, and the rehabilitation project has to meet the standards in order to take advantage of the program.
So if the owner of a non-contributing property wants to be considered contributing, is there a process for that?
The process that we saw in Newark was that they did additional research and documentation to expand the period of significance and the areas of significance for the historic district, and they had to update the entire district in order to recategorize their property so that they could take advantage of the program, which they did successfully, and apparently their pro forma worked out for that.
Is there any data on whether or not like the economic value or the values of properties within a given historic district increase in value just by virtue of being in that district?
The Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, which is a federal advisory organization that advises the president on historic preservation matters, has accumulated a library of economic impact studies from across the country that they have links to on their website, and the overwhelming majority find that historic designation, whether it's at the local level or the federal level, does not have a negative impact on property value. It holds it steady or causes it to increase slightly higher at a slightly faster rate than other comparable property in the same area. And it's sort of in some ways like being part of a condo complex where you might pay a little bit more, but you have some assurances that your neighbors are going to keep the character of the complex and you know what you're buying into. And when a lot of people feel the same way about historic districts, that if you're investing yourself in a historic district and a historic rehabilitation, it's nice to know that your neighbors are likely to do the same thing and that the character of the area is going to hold true through time.
John, are there any other questions or comments from anybody?
We didn't have any more chat questions, but if any of the other owners want to, you know,
Can I ask a question about the way the designations are made? The Belmont building is considered a one-story building, correct? Yet historically, it's a multi-story building. How do I get that designation fixed?
So you're suggesting that there's an error in the characterization of one of the properties in the draft nomination?
Yes.
Okay, you could send information to the Historic Preservation Office. You could come and we could try and address that. You could come to the October 2nd meeting of the New Jersey State Review Board and as part of public testimony, offer that information to them, and they could choose to include that in any corrections or additions that they request before the nomination is considered for signature by the Assistant Commissioner.
Your guidelines state that you have a specific time frame in which the standards are applied. What I'm saying is that Maplewood is more historic than that. Maplewood's history goes back, as you stated, to 1902, that you are stating. 1902, the Belmont building was 2 stories or more. It's a multi-story building.
Okay.
All of the buildings in the Maplewood Village were wooden story buildings. If we, at that time, had made the same designation, would Maplewood look the same?
not from that far back, I don't think.
So when we're looking at historic districts and the period of development that makes the building the ensemble, right? It's the period in which we are seeing it now, but that reflects that period of significance that has been designated by the history. So even though Maplewood itself goes back to the 18th century, the historic district best reflects the time period in that period of significance. So,
Okay, so you're locking it in time. Is that what you're basically saying?
Well, no, but we're not. We're trying to determine the boundaries.
The history of the village is dynamic change and diversity. You're limiting the diversity of the village by what you're doing.
I don't believe we are. That doesn't mean that things can't change or that you can't have infill, but we have to kind of set a time period in which to sort of gauge everything by. But that doesn't mean that the district can't be allowed to evolve or that there wasn't a prehistory to it. It just happens that it's reflecting what it is during that time period best reflects, because it doesn't 100%.
How do you determine that time period, and what gives you the right to tell us as property owners that you can determine a time period in which our buildings must comply to compared to what they've complied to through the history, which is dynamic, diverse change?
Okay, so the way that the National Register nomination is set up is you have to develop this period of significance in order to sort of gauge where a district is in its time frame and what it best reflects. But to say that, let's say that the period of significance is 1902 to I think it's like to the 1960s, it currently reflects the time period of today, right? Because since that time, the post office is now gone, but there's a new building that is in the historic district that shows the evolution. It just sort of gives us something to grasp by in which to make decisions. It does not negate what happened previously, nor does it negate what happened after the period of significance. It just gives us a framework in which to work by, to be able to grab hold on to be able to make decisions. But that doesn't mean that the buildings can't continue to evolve, because they have been evolving even beyond that period of significance.
Specifically, though, you're negating the advancement of the building that I'm in, because it used to be a multi-story building. Now it's a single-story building, and you're confining it by your definition. If we move from the National Registry to a local registry, I am now badly hurt by what you've done with the National Registry.
In what way?
I don't believe that's true, because you could still, if you believe your building had significance of 2 stories way back when, before the period of significance, you can build it that way now. You can put it back to 2 stories right now. This regulation doesn't prevent that.
And I'm supposed to do it
You
right
can
now,
add-
as
you can
opposed
make
to
it a
when it makes
2-story
sense for me to
building
do it?
with a new design, and nothing is preventing you from doing that.
Can we,
There's no
can we,
Nothing at the
prevention.
moment until you move it to a local designation. By putting it in such a
This has nothing to do with local
designation, you're
designation.
making it easier to move to the local designation.
can I just
Nothing to do with that.
can I just give one example of where this might apply to the Belmont? Is the Drake building was historically a 1-story building, and since the first the area where we said, you know, potentially had a historic district, they added a 2nd story. Even with that 2nd story, we still consider that building a contributing resource, because the essence of the Drake building is still visible in the architecture with that 2nd story, which again goes to show that building evolution can still survive in a historic district. That's actually a really good example, particularly for your property, because it can be done while still respecting what is currently there. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, except for what I see is I see a designation right now by the federal designation. And if it becomes the local designation, I have a much harder time building a 2-story building or a 3-story building or a multi-story building to replace what always was a multi-story building.
Actually, Mr. Savitas, first off, as we've been saying, this does not lead in any way, shape, or form necessarily to a local designation. However,
not necessarily, but the likelihood is there more so than if this designation is not pushed on.
And I'm trying to finish my thought. However, because if anyone can identify that the building was a 2-story or a multi-story building or a glass box, I don't want to sound condescending, but if for some reason there was a glass box there, you're free to go back, even if it was historically designated locally, which it is not, which is not what we're proposing. But even if it was, if you can prove the historical significance of the building as a multi-story building, there is a very well trod path on how you can get your building to be built the way you want it to be built.
And that's a cost on me that I don't have to encounter if this doesn't go through.
This is not local designation. You're misconstruing a lot of what we've been talking about all evening. This is not a precursor to local designation.
When the preliminary filed was made, was there an error on the preliminary filing as far as the designation?
What preliminary filing are you talking about?
What error?
There's a particular thing that was checked, right, Mr. Savitas, that you were concerned with?
Yes.
And what was it?
What is that?
That the local designation was checked on the preliminary filing.
I don't think it is local.
Local significance.
Local significance is very different.
Yeah, that just gives us that's again a framework in which, you know, the Maplewood is a nice historic district, but it is not nationally significant, let's say like Cape May, which has a preponderance of one type of building and is a larger district and has other criteria. That I could be wrong, but I think that falls under the national significance. Maplewood is of local significance, but that doesn't mean it's locally designated. Right. You know, that's just sort of, you know, local, regional, or local, statewide, national. Those are criteria established by the federal government to sort of give people who are putting the nominations together a framework in which to work by. So this way we're not kind of being grandiose when we probably shouldn't be grandiose.
Let me just ask one question, because Margaret, you mentioned the Drake and talked about it now being included as a two-story building during this time frame of historic significance. If this designation had been in place 5 years ago and somebody bought the building, the Drake, and then decided to put a second story on, would they have had any more issues than they did putting a second story on with the town, village alliance, the state?
Yeah, they would be subject to all of the same local rules that they're subject to now. There's no additional local review because of New Jersey and National Register designation.
Only if they
So
were
if I-
only
sorry.
if they were looking for federal funding,
Right, only if they were going for money.
Okay, gotcha.
which they wouldn't be able to go after if it wasn't on the National Register anyway.
Correct.
So it is a funding source that is unavailable to the town, to the Maplewood Village now, that this designation opens up to many properties that aren't available to them now.
Understood, but that, right, and that would only help you if you were doing something, again, historically significant. But so just quite simply, if like what you're telling me is that if I were to want to add a second story, and it was, appropriate, as you're saying, Andrea, with all the existing codes, this designation would not change anything in that.
As long as it was privately owned and the project was privately sponsored and funded, and there was no government involvement, good to go.
Thank you.
Does the Historic Society go before the Maplewood Village Alliance when the Maplewood Village Alliance is considering proposals?
What are you I don't understand the question.
Okay. So the Village Alliance is going to get influenced by the Historic Society when they have this designation more than they are currently, correct?
No, they are not.
No, there's no
There is no
local,
change. There is no change in that jurisdiction or the process.
So they won't be coming before us on the Village Alliance?
No more so than before. No change whatsoever.
so Savas, if you wanted to put a second story on your building under this designation, you could go for historic tax credits and grants that you wouldn't be available to you if not for the designation. So if you wanted to put residential up above your single story, your currently single story building, you would actually be able to get financial help potentially that you wouldn't get otherwise. Just saying.
I'm sorry, financial help from,
Potentially. It would have to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards.
But without it, there's no potential for that.
Correct.
Right.
I think Mr. Savidis's question opens up an avenue to answer a question that came up before. What are some of the reasons people may oppose New Jersey and National Register listing of an eligible district? And that has to do with an argument about the future, which is, unknowable. Nobody has a perfect crystal ball, and people's opinions will understandably differ about what is likely to happen in the future based on whether this nomination goes forward to listing or not. And we have had a history at the Historic Preservation Office of receiving letters of opposition based on a belief similar to Mr. Savidis's belief that this is likely to lead to local designation that he would presumably oppose. And other people can be of the other opinion that it is not likely to lead. And so it's really, there's no absolute answer that one can give in the here and now about an event that may or may not happen in the future. So that's something to take into consideration about those who might oppose the nomination on that basis. I don't share that view, but I do understand that there are people who feel that way and who argue against the listing based on a concern about something they wouldn't want to happen in the future that this listing might make more likely than not.
So can I ask a question? For the Township Committee could actually begin a local designation without either the state or national listing. Is that correct?
100% correct, as
Right.
long as
So-
you meet your local ordinance requirements.
Right. So the Township Committee has not taken that step. And
Right.
if it wanted to in the future, whether or not it was on any other list would be immaterial.
Right.
It'd be up to them at the time, whoever's sitting on the Township Committee,
Right.
to decide whether or not to move forward on a local designation.
Correct.
Yes.
So this is not a prerequisite for the Township Committee to do anything. We could have done it right now. We've decided not to do it because there's no interest in doing it locally. And in the future, some other Township Committee is going to have to make that same decision. And whether or not it's on any kind of other list, they're going to have to make that decision based on the current situation, not about any list that they're on.
Good point.
Correct.
We have, if I can change the subject, we have another question on the chat, which I think is the easy one to answer, and we have answered, but I want to make sure that question is heard from Tim Fryatt. The question was, if a new building were proposed in the historic district, would SHPO review be required? And I believe our answer is, if it's privately owned, no, and if it's publicly owned, yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Thank you. Thank you for the question too.
Privately owned and privately owned and privately funded.
Correct. That's true. Correct.
Everybody needs to remember, I keep harping on this, but it should be a welcomed double-edged positive, because if you're not getting public funding, you're not restricted. However, it opens up public funding for people who weren't previously open to it. So I don't understand why there's any, why there should be any pushback, because we're not restricting private ownership and private funding. We're encouraging public funding of certain aspects. Win-win.
So John, I think it's getting pretty late.
Yeah. We're past the 10 o'clock mark.
If there's any pressing questions, I mean, there is always the opportunity to come to an HPC meeting or to email me as the liaison or you as the chair.
Yep.
Any questions that didn't get covered tonight.
Yeah, we're having our next HPC meeting 1 week from tonight, same, time, 8 p.m., same channel, the Zoom. We'll send out a link for that. So, we've covered this topic, be aware that the October 2nd hearing is coming up at the review board, right? And then if any opposition is to be submitted in writing, it has to be ahead of time, as stated previously. So I think we've covered all the questions. So I wanted to thank everybody, and thank you, Nancy, and all the township committee members for joining us, and Mayor Frank. And of course, thank you to Margaret Hickey and Andrea Tingey for the great presentation and all of your time and effort on the whole project, not just tonight, but all of the time leading up to this. And I want to say thank you to Susan for getting this thing organized, because life calls and we get pretty busy. She really stepped up and helped us out to get this ready for tonight. So thank you, Susan.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the other reps from the state too. Thanks for taking time this evening to help answer some of these questions.
Right.
So good night, everybody.
So if we have more questions, we will subject them to Andrea and everyone else. Because again, there were a couple
Yeah.
questions that were lacked clarity and were nuanced.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
with
can, you
their
can email
response.
us at our website has our email address, and we get that. Daniel get that. Someone distributes them to us, and we can answer them. Like I said, we're here next Wednesday again, same time, same channel, so to speak. That's our monthly meeting, and we do it every third Wednesday of every month except August. Everyone's welcome to join. There's lots of other topics. We talk about our properties, mostly the park. So that's our most important property. So,
John, I wanted to mention that this meeting has been recorded
yeah,
and will be placed on the town YouTube site
yeah,
in a few days if you want to sit through this again.
yeah. You haven't had enough.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you very
everybody,
much.
Good night.
for your
Good
time.
night.
Andrea,
Okay.
thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.
So what I got from that was that won't affect you at all.
Bye, Margaret.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Gary.